today we're going to be looking at the poem Poppies. Just a quick reminder of the highlighter code if you're using it. So yellow is word analysis, pink will be device analysis, green is structural analysis, and orange is ideas about power and conflict. So we'll talk about the context of the poem first, then we'll read through, and then we will tackle the poem, key lines, key annotations, and pick out the three main quotations. So we'll get straight into the poem itself. So the poem was written in 2009, and it was actually commissioned by Carol Ann Duffy, so the writer, the poet who wrote War Photographer and was a poet laureate. And essentially she wanted to publish, I believe it was in a newspaper, 10 poems about the recent conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq. And she wanted them to be kind of poems about the families. And Jane Weir here, she was inspired by the fact that she was a parent, she had young children, and she kind of has said in interviews that she thought about Susan Owen, which is Wilfred Owen's mother, who would have found out just, I think she found out the morning of or the morning before the war ended, about the death of her son, Wilfred Owen, because he died about a week before the war ended. So she said that she's been inspired by that. Now, what it's also worth drawing your attention to is that the poem, it mentions 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and that's kind of when the poem is set. So just a mention of what Armistice Sunday is. Hopefully you already know this, but it's the 11th of November, and it's on that, well, it doesn't always fall on the 11th of November, obviously, but it was the formal, formal peace agreement of World War I fell on the 11th of November 1918. So that's when, and the Sunday that's closest to the 11th of November is when we now remember the end of World War I, and when we wear the poppies. And the poem is obviously called Poppies, and you'll get a sense why. Now remember, this poem is full of symbols, and poppies are a symbol of remembrance, and that's, I think, why she's titled the poem that. So I'm going to read it, and hopefully you'll think about why it might be inspired by Susan Owen, Wilfred Owen's mother, and then we'll start annotating it. So, Poppies. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimmed petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me. Skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the wall memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. So this is a poem about a mother who has lost their child to war. Some people read it as he's just gone off to war, but I mean, the poet Jane Weir has said that he has died and she was inspired by Susan Owen, so let's just kind of read it from that angle for now. And that's what the poem's about. So the poem's about, she kind of, in terms of structure, it shifts, it goes from the past to now to the present. So we'll go through these structural things first, just so we all know what's going on. So currently, it's 3 days before Armistice Sunday. She then remembers before he left. So it's almost like a flashback, this section here, all the way down to here. Then she goes to after he'd gone. There's just a short line there about when he leaves, what she does. Although this bit is quite ambiguous because we don't know whether she means after he'd passed away or after he'd gone to war. Then we've got later, and that's where she is now. So later is the 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and later is what she's doing, as I just read and hopefully you picked up. She's going up to his grave, the war memorial with his name on, and then at the end she's listening out for his childhood voice. So it kind of comes back to those memories of before he left. So let's start from the opening of the poem then. I've highlighted all the stuff green, and what we'll do at the end is we'll just do the structure box and just add a few thoughts about how the structure is used. So Weir opens with this kind of image of these poppies on war graves. So she's immediately telling us that the poem is about remembrance, because that's what poppies are for. She's telling us that it's a poem about loss and about what happens to people after war. Okay, so we should already be thinking of all the different poems that are about the impact of war. So, poppies, I'm doing this in orange as a general comment on war and conflict, but it's worth mentioning. Poppies, symbol of remembrance, indicates poem maybe about loss. Okay, we then have this quite strange description, I would say, some really weird imagery. The poppies are described as spasms of paper red, and then she uses a metaphor of his the kind of piping on his blazer being a blockade. So we'll just talk about those two things first of all. So the imagery here of poppies as spasms is quite unusual, because it's kind of making the actual poppy itself seem uncomfortable, and what we can possibly guess is because she's thinking about this with hindsight, because she's looking back on this event, poppies now to her will symbolise that remembrance of her son as opposed to remembrance in general. This idea of blockade is really interesting. So it seems like there's a barrier. In this case, it's between the blazer and the poppy, a bit weird, but this is also kind of metaphorical, and this idea of him before he left anyway, there being kind of like some sort of, I'm going to say barrier again, some sort of barrier between him and his mother is quite interesting. There's a real semantic field of regret throughout this poem, because she, when he leaves, all she can see him as is her little child, her little boy, and she struggles to kind of see him as a man who's ready to go off into the world. And this blockade is the first kind of hint of this. Now, in the next stanza, there's some really maternal imagery here. This idea of sellotape bandaged around her hand, like collecting up the cat hairs. there's a real love from her of looking after him before he goes away. Now, she tries to, there's all this kind of language, we'll do it in yellow for semantic fields because it's keywords. So we've got wanted, resisted, and then on the next page on the final line, so just turn over and do that one as well, hoping. So we'll just make a note of it around here where it is. So this semantic field of regret it highlights to us her difficulty in coming to terms with her loss, because that's really what the poem's about. The poem is dealing with ideas of grief and loss of someone close to you, and it's caused by war, but the poem isn't so much about the war, it's about the impact on the family. And then we get the sense that she regrets the way she left him. Well, he left her, but you know what I mean. Okay, another word to zoom in on here is, it's not just here though, it's throughout the poem, so we've got it up here as well. Your. So she uses second person. So she directly addresses or speaks the poem to her son. So it's a very personal poem and she's exploring their relationship. And it almost feels like this is something that she's saying to him after his death. Something she's thinking of, perhaps saying to the war memorial at the end. We don't really know, but that's the kind of impression that we're given by this constant second person address. Now, this final bit at the end of the poem, at the end of this stanza, this is really interesting. So I mentioned up here about this barrier between them. Here's another example of the barrier. She wants to run her fingers through her hair. So there's lots of imagery here of how you would treat a young child. So the idea of the Eskimos rubbing the noses together, the idea of lifting up his collar and taking the hairs off his suit, and then running her fingers through his hair. It's a lot of quite maternal imagery, so we'll just make a note of that at the top of the stanza. But she doesn't do it, so it's kind of unusual. She does do the rounding up the cat hairs and she does the collar, but then she doesn't graze her nose and she doesn't run her fingers through his hair. She resists that impulse, but she describes his hair as gel blackthorns, which I think is a really interesting metaphor. So he's obviously spiked his hair up in some way. And she thinks that's almost, looking back with hindsight, she thinks that's almost an intentional decision. So, like, again, a barrier against her kind of still treating him as a child. Now, the reason he doesn't want to be treated as a child is because he's about to head off to war, right? And he is excited by this new world that is being offered to him by joining the army, and we'll come back to that in a second. I just want to talk about this here, although, to be honest, I might come back to it. So there's some textiles imagery here, but there's more textiles imagery later, so I'll come back to that felt again. Let's talk about her words melting. So again, that adds to that sense of regret. So the verb melting almost tells us that her words are like fading away because she doesn't quite know what to say to him when he leaves. But again, remember, this is all with hindsight after she's lost him, so she's looking back on this memory. And she says that she was brave walking with him, and they open the door and the world is overflowing like a treasure chest, which is just a wonderful simile. So we'll look at that. But there's some structural thing to notice here as well, this enjambment, so this sense of constant overflowing. It's a great use of enjambment. So I'll just note the enjambment here. So that's kind of to do with the constant overflowing or excitement of the world. Now the simile is interesting because it shows that he still does have that kind of childish nature, because he's seeing the world as like a treasure chest, and obviously treasure chests happen in like stories. But it tells us how excited he is at the world. But possibly immature. And this kind of juxtaposes with the word she uses to describe him, which is intoxicated. So it's almost like he's drunk with this idea of a new life. Let's just put adjective. I haven't got much room here. Drunk. It's almost like, yeah, he's drunk with this excitement of going off to be a soldier, and that's what eventually is what kills him. Now, into the next line, this is after you'd gone, but as I said, this is quite ambiguous. We don't know whether that means after he'd left for war or after he died. Now, I normally read it as after he died, and the reason is what she does is she goes into the bedroom and she releases a songbird from its cage. Now, this is really interesting. Obviously, it's a metaphor, and birds in literature generally represent things like freedom. Songbirds are interesting because they are one of few birds where the actual noise that they make is quite nice to listen to. But what is going on here with this metaphor? So this is, first of all, let's just mention that this is one of your key quotations, so I'll just pause there. So, released a songbird from its cage. So this metaphor, we get the sense that she had something trapped and something that she felt like she needed to let go of. And the way I read this is it's to do with her grief. And some people might say that's actually to do with when he leaves for war, so it's almost her view of him that she's releasing. But it's quite a complex metaphor and it's quite ambiguous. You can kind of read it the way you want to read it. But this idea of, it's definitely to do with letting go or coping with something that's happened or coming to terms with it. And that's why I would say that it's more to do with coming to terms with her loss of him, whether that was just after the war and him going away, or whether it is also him passing away. What we've also got is this dove. And doves are mentioned a couple of times throughout the poem, and again it's that reference to birds, so, you know, releasing something or something flying away, whatever. Now, a dove is a symbol across literature and across everything, actually, religion, and they mean kind of like peace. It's probably the most common one, but they're also seen as messengers in religion. And what she begins to do is follow the dove, and it's almost like the dove is helping her, is guiding her to a sense of peace and to come to terms with what's happened. If we look now, and I'll make reference back to this idea of felt up here, if we look down to my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats. It's a nice synthetic list. And again, that enjambment, that sense of ongoing busyness in her stomach. What we have here is some really interesting textiles imagery, which is used again at the top of the bottom of the previous stanza. There's some really interesting ways that Weir's using this kind of textiles imagery. It represents something to us that's quite domestic and perhaps maternal. But also what she's doing is she's using the different movements of textiles to present her different feelings. So when she talks about the words being flattened and rolled and turned into felt, it's almost like the emotions are compressing, right? And then the words are compressing and they melt away, they disappear. And we get the same sense here. So her stomach is busy and it's almost like stitching on top of itself. And you might have heard of the phrase like butterflies in your stomach, that kind of like nervousness. But that's kind of her way of creating that imagery, is using this textiles kind of imagery, which I think is really interesting. And interestingly, Weir herself is involved in the textiles industry, so I think it's quite interesting that she uses that sort of imagery in the poem. One thing to mention down here is where she describes her winter clothing as a reinforcement. And I think this is just an interesting use of language to do with power and conflict. So it's almost it's kind of a bit of military language. And this is, so I've put conflict on her mind, so permanent impact of war. And that's not only on the soldiers, but also the family themselves. Hopefully, as I'm saying these things, you're linking this to lots of other poems that we've done to do with the effects of conflict and the effect of war. And also a female voice is quite interesting. It's the only female voice to do with conflict, maybe other than the Emigre, actually. Okay, final stanza then. This bit's quite it's quite emotive, this bit, where she goes up to the top of the churchyard and sees the war memorial. It's got the first, so it's got the reference again to the dove here. The dove is like pulling against the sky. But what it's got is one of your key quotations, which I'm gonna just unpick in a little bit of detail. I'll do it just down here because this is probably the richest kind of one in terms of analysis. Now, I would normally show you an image of a wishbone, so I'm going to have an image of a wishbone come up on the screen now, just so you know what it is. Okay, so a wishbone is the thing that you pull apart, and it's kind of designed in this sort of structure, right? That's how the bone is. And what she's doing is she's using this image of the wishbone to describe the way she is leaning against the war memorial. So the war memorial's there and she's leaning against it and she feels like a wishbone. So there's lots of kind of imagery in this. So we'll start with the simile, like a wishbone. There's lots of things we can pick from this. So it feels almost like she's being pulled apart. Perhaps that she needs the strength to hold her up, the strength of the kind of war memorial. But also, if you look at wishbone by itself, so it's a noun, wishbones are broken, right? So they are not made to be broken, but this is the image that's come into popular kind of into our minds about wishbones. So in that sense then they are fragile and easily broken. And the question I guess is this how she sees herself following the death of her son, as like a wishbone, fragile, one pull away from kind of breaking apart? It's a really, really good simile in describing how she must be feeling. Now if we look at the verb leaned, I've kind of said it's sort of here, but there's a sense that she has to like rely on the memorial because she still hasn't quite accepted the loss of her son yet. Okay, so she's still seeking out that connection with him. And that's made even clearer, I think, with this final line, which we'll go to now. and we'll do it in orange because there's not really so much a device with this as more it tells us a lot about conflict. She says that she's hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. There's a few things we can say about this to do with conflict. I want to start with the impact on the family. So impact on families involved in war. In this case, it's a loss of a son, but obviously people can lose husbands, nephews, uncles, nieces, wives. Any loss of a family member is particularly horrific, but really what Jane Weir is saying here is that war causes this. War creates this sense of grieving, this difficult grief. Also, there's a hint here, I think, about conflict in terms of a loss of innocence. Notice how what she's listening for is him as a child. She's lost her child, her son, and that war has killed off that innocence. And then we'll just go to the bottom. So we'll just make a comment on the structure here. So in terms of structure, we've got time phrases, because the poem moves across, I guess, three points. When he left, after he left, and then now. And then secondly, we've got the use of enjambment to show that kind of ongoing emotion. Let's put lack of emotional control. Okay, next question. What poems could we link this to? I think you can probably tell there's quite a few that this poem links nicely to. So, links to... Okay, we'll start with the Emigre. Links with the Emigre, they're both female voices, but they're also both about loss. And they're about memory. So in that case, it can also link with remains. And that's to do with impact of conflict, but also memory. It can also link with, I've just put that wrong, My Last Duchess, in terms of death and loss. And then a final one, I think it is nice to link it with exposure. And I would talk about perhaps the mental impact of conflict and what it does on the individual. Whereas obviously it's interesting there because one poem's about the person in war, one's about someone outside of war, but they both get impacted. There's definitely a mental impact on both of them. Okay, hopefully you understand that poem now. It's a really good one. It's been on the GCSE for a while, so actually there's quite a lot online about it, and there's a really good video of the poet talking through it. All you need to do is search on YouTube Jane Weir Poppies, and that'll come up. See you soon.